The Galactic Concordance had ruled the Orion, armed for 12,000 years, and in all that time nothing had truly surprised them. 17 species lived under their great alliance, and each one believed they had seen everything the universe could offer. Their fleets numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and their stations orbited stars both young and ancient. They had mapped every corner of their territory, and they believed themselves to be the greatest civilization that had ever existed. High Arbiter Selvith of the monitoring caste stood in the command center of station, Veth Prime, and watched the sensor displays with all 6 of her eyes. She was old by the standards of her kind, and she had seen many strange things in her centuries of service, but nothing had prepared her for what appeared on her screens that morning. The anomaly came without warning. One moment the edge of the Veth system was empty, and the next moment it was not. 47 ships emerged from nowhere, and they did not arrive the way ships were supposed to arrive. The Concordance used gravity wells to bend space and travel between stars, but these vessels did something different. Space did not bend around them. It tore. The fabric of reality ripped open like flesh under a knife, and the ships came through the wound. Selvith felt her scales tighten against her body as she watched the readings flood across her display. The ships were dark and angular and wrong in ways that made her sensors stutter and fail. Every time they tried to scan the vessels, the equipment gave back errors and impossible numbers. "What is this?" she whispered to herself. Her second-in-command rushed to her side, and his forearms trembled as he spoke. "High Arbiter, we cannot identify them, and they match nothing in our archives." Selvith ordered a full sensor sweep of the mysterious fleet. The results came back fragmented and strange, but they told her enough. The ships were military vessels without any doubt. They bristled with weapons that her equipment could not properly analyze, and their hulls showed signs of damage and repair. These were not new ships. These were ships that had seen battle, many battles. "Open a communication channel," Selvith commanded. The communication officers worked their consoles and broadcast greetings in 400 different languages. They sent mathematical sequences and universal symbols of peace. They transmitted everything the Concordance used to make first contact with new species. The human fleet did not respond. The ships simply sat there at the edge of the system and waited. They did not advance, and they did not retreat. They hung in the void like predators, conserving their strength. Hours passed, and still the fleet remained silent. Selvith ordered her people to search every archive and every database for any information about ships like these. The answer came back from an old survey file that had been forgotten for 2 centuries. A small blue world on the far edge of the galaxy had been briefly observed by a Concordance scout ship 200 years ago. The inhabitants called themselves humans, and at the time, they had been a primitive species. They had not yet discovered faster than light travel. They had barely begun to explore their own star system. The scout had marked them as insignificant and moved on. Selvith read the old report and felt a cold dread settle into her hearts. 200 years was nothing to the Concordance. But clearly, it had been enough time for humanity to change. She looked back at the sensor display and counted the weapons on just one of the human ships. There were more weapons on that single vessel than on an entire Concordance patrol squadron. "Send word to the High Council," she ordered her second-in-command. "Tell them we have visitors." The council responded within hours, and their decision was to send a diplomatic vessel, the ship Eternal. Patience was one of the finest in the Concordance fleet, and its captain was the legendary Ambassador Keth Morith. He was a being of great composure and wisdom, and he had negotiated peace between species that had warred for millennia. If anyone could make contact with these humans, it would be him. The Eternal Patience approached the human fleet slowly and carefully. Ambassador Keth Morith broadcast greetings and offers of friendship. He spoke of the glory of the Concordance and the benefits of peaceful cooperation. He promised trade and technology. and a place among the great civilizations of the galaxy. For a long time, there was no response. Then a single transmission came from the largest of the human ships. It was not a greeting, it was not a demand. It was a set of coordinates, nothing more. Kethmoreth studied the coordinates and found that they pointed to a location in deep space. There was nothing at those coordinates according to concordance maps, just empty void far from any star or planet. The council debated what to do. The military Cast argued that it was a trap and that they should destroy the human fleet before it could threaten concordance territory. The diplomatic caste argued that they should follow the coordinates and learn what the humans wanted to show them. Selveth listened to the arguments and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She was the one who had first seen the fleet. She was the one who would have to advise the council in the end. She made her choice. We go to the coordinates. She said, "We must know what they want." The council agreed, and a delegation was assembled. Ambassador Kethmoreth would lead the mission with Selveth at his side. A small escort of Concordance warships would accompany them. They set out the next day, and the human fleet did not follow them. The vessels remained at the edge of the Veth system and continued their silent vigil. The journey to the coordinates took 3 days. When they arrived, Selveth understood immediately why the humans had sent them there. It was a graveyard. Thousands of ships drifted dead in the void, and every single one of them was human. Battle damage scarred every hull, and some of the vessels had been torn completely in half. Debris floated everywhere, and among the wreckage, Selveth saw frozen bodies in spacesuits, human bodies. So many of them, but that was not the worst of it. Among the human wreckage, there was something else. Something massive. Something that stretched for light minutes across the empty space. It was not human, and it was not concordance. It was biomechanical and utterly alien, a nightmare of flesh and metal twisted together into shapes that hurt to look at. Whatever it was dead now. The humans had killed it, but the cost had been beyond anything Selveth could imagine. She stared at the graveyard and felt fear for the first time in centuries. Not fear of the humans, fear of what they had been fighting, and fear of what might still be coming. The delegation floated among the wreckage for hours, and nobody spoke. Ambassador Kethmoreth stood at the observation window of his ship and watched the debris drift past. He had lived for 400 years, and he had seen many terrible things. Wars between species that left planets burned and lifeless, plagues that killed billions before cures could be found, natural disasters that shattered moons and tore apart stations, but he had never seen anything like this. The human dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands at least. Their ships had been warships and supply vessels and medical frigates and evacuation transports, an entire fleet destroyed in a battle so fierce that it left scars on the fabric of space itself. And among the human wreckage lay the corpse of something monstrous. Kethmoreth studied the biomechanical remains through the sensors. The thing had been alive. Once it had been a ship or a creature, or perhaps both at the same time. Its hull was made of metal and bone fused together. Weapons had grown from its body like tumors. It stretched for thousands of kilometers, and even in death, it radiated a wrongness that made his scales itch. "What is it?" Selveth asked from beside him. "I do not know," Kethmoreth admitted. The answer came from an unexpected source. A small human shuttle detached from the largest vessel in the mysterious fleet and flew toward the concordant ships. It requested permission to dock, and after a moment of hesitation, Kethmoreth granted it. The human who stepped aboard the Eternal Patience was female, and she walked with the careful steps of someone who had been injured many times. Scars covered her face, and her left arm was mechanical from the elbow down. Her eyes were dark and tired, and they held the weight of someone who had seen too much death. She introduced herself as Admiral Chun, and she was the commander of the human fleet. "You wanted to know why we came," she said in a voice that was rough and weary. "This is why." She gestured at the graveyard, visible through the observation window. We call them the Devourers, and they came from outside the galaxy 60 years ago. Chun told them the story, and it was worse than anything they could have imagined. The Devourers had arrived without warning, and they had attacked human colony worlds with a hunger that could not be satisfied. They consumed everything. Ships and stations and cities and people. They ate metal and flesh and energy itself. 11 human colonies fell in the first decade of the war. Billions of people died screaming as the Devourers descended on their worlds. We did not know how to fight them at first, Chun explained. Our weapons did nothing, and our ships could not match their speed. We died by the millions while we tried to learn. But humanity had learned. They had studied the Devourers and found their weaknesses. They had built new weapons and new ships, designed specifically to kill these monsters. They had sacrificed everything to survive. The war lasted 60 years, and it cost humanity almost everything they had. Their population had been reduced to a fraction of what it once was. Their colonies were burned, and their fleets were shattered. But they had won. The last great battle had taken place right here in this empty space. 200 human ships against the Devourer armada that darkened the stars. Only 12 human vessels survived. Chun paused, and her mechanical hand clenched into a fist. We won, she repeated. But winning was not enough. She told them what the humans had discovered after the battle. They had traced the path the Devourers had taken to reach human space. They had followed the trail backward through the galaxy, and they had found something that filled them with cold fury. The Devourers had passed through concordant space. They had traveled past concordance systems and concordance stations and concordance worlds. They had come within scanning range of concordance fleets. And the concordance had never noticed the mighty civilization that ruled the Orion Arm had been completely blind to the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced. You were so weak, Chun said, and there was no anger in her voice, only a terrible exhaustion. The Devourers saw you and calculated that you were not worth the effort of killing. They passed you by like you were nothing. Kethmoreth felt his heart stutter in his chest. That cannot be true, he said. Our sensors would have detected them. Chun shook her head. Your sensors are designed to find ships like your own. The Devourers do not travel like you do. They move through dimensions your science has not discovered. They could be in your territory right now, and you would never know. Selva stepped forward, and her voice trembled. Why are you telling us this? Chun looked at her with those tired, dark eyes. Because more are coming. The ones we killed here were only the first wave. There is a second wave, traveling toward the galaxy right now. And when it arrives, it will not ignore you. It will come for the concordance. It will come for everyone. She walked to the observation window and stared out at the graveyard. We came here to warn you. You have perhaps 2 years before the second wave arrives. 2 years to build ships that can fight them. 2 years to train soldiers who can survive them. 2 years to become something more than you are now. She turned back to face them. We will help you if you let us. We will share our weapons and our tactics and everything we learned in 60 years of war. But you have to choose to fight. You have to choose to be ready. Kethmoreth looked at Selveth and saw his own fear reflected. In her 6 eyes, the galaxy was not safe. It had never been safe. They had simply been too blind to see the danger. We will bring your warning to the council, he said at last, and we will pray that they listen. Chun nodded, but there was no hope in her expression. Pray if you want, she said, but build warships while you pray. The Devourers do not care about your gods. They only care about your flesh. The High Council of the Concordance listened to the warning, and they did not believe it. They sat in their great chamber on the capital world, and they heard every word that Ambassador Kethmoreth spoke. They saw the recordings from the graveyard, and they studied the sensor data from the mysterious fleet. And when he was finished, they shook their heads and clicked their mandibles and made sounds of dismissal. Impossible, said Archon Velder, who led the military caste. Our sensors cover every inch of concordant space. Nothing could pass through our territory without detection. The humans are lying or they are deceived. Other council members agreed with him. Perhaps the humans had fought some minor threat and exaggerated the danger. Perhaps this was an elaborate trick to weaken the concordance before an invasion. Perhaps these strange visitors were simply mad from their long years of isolation. Selva stood in the corner of the chamber and felt frustration building. Inside her, she had seen the graveyard. She had looked into the eyes of Admiral Chun. She knew in her deepest hearts that the human woman had spoken the truth. But the council did not want to hear the truth. The truth was too frightening. Honored. Once, Selva spoke up and every eye turned to her. I suggest we allow the humans to demonstrate their claims. Let them show us what they have seen. Let them prove what they say is true. The council debated her suggestion for hours, but and they agreed. If the humans wanted to be believed, they would have to provide proof. Admiral Chun accepted the invitation without hesitation. She brought a small delegation of human officers to the Concordance capital. They arrived in a shuttle that was battered and scarred and covered in markings that recorded the battles it had survived. The humans themselves were no different. Every single one of them carried scars on their bodies, and their eyes held shadows that never seemed to fade. Chun requested permission to show the council one of her vessels. A destroyer called the Unbroken had been brought to orbit around the capital world. It was one of the smallest ships in the human fleet, but even so it dwarfed the Concordance cruisers that surrounded it. The council agreed to tour the vessel, and what they saw changed everything. The Unbroken was not a beautiful ship. It was ugly and brutal, and designed for only one purpose. Killing weapons covered every surface of the hull, and each one was more powerful than anything the Concordance had ever built. The armor was not metal as the Concordance understood it. It was grown from the harvested carapace of dead devourers. The humans had learned to turn their enemy into protection. Inside the ship, the council saw technology that made their finest achievements look like toys. Reactors that produced power levels the Concordance could not measure. Engines that tore holes in space itself. Medical bays designed to rebuild soldiers from the edge of death, and soldiers. The human soldiers terrified the council more than anything else. They stood in their powered armor, and they towered over even the largest concordant species. Their suits enhanced their already frightening physical strength to levels that seemed impossible. They moved with the precision of machines, but their eyes burned with something wild and alive. How long did it take you to develop this technology? Asked Archon Velder. His voice was quiet now, and all his earlier arrogance had vanished. 53 years, Chun replied. The first 7 years of the war, we just died. We had nothing that could hurt the Devourers, and they slaughtered us without mercy. But we learned. Every death taught us something. Every battle made us stronger, and eventually we became strong enough to fight back. She led them to the tactical center of the ship. There she showed them the archive. It contained recordings from every major battle of the war. The council watched in silence as the recordings played. They saw human ships diving into swarms of devourers with weapons blazing. They saw worlds burning as the monsters descended. They saw stations torn apart and populations consumed. They saw humans die by the thousands, and then by the millions. But they also saw humans fight. They saw crews refuse to abandon their ships even as they were torn apart. They saw soldiers charging into certain death to buy time for civilians to escape. They saw scientists working until the last moment to find new weapons. They saw a species that simply refused to give up. The final recording was the Battle of Last Light. It was the engagement that had created the graveyard. 200 human ships against an armada that filled the sky. The humans had known they could not win. They had known that most of them would die. They had fought anyway. The battle lasted 9 days. When it ended, only 12 human ships remained intact, but the Devourer Armada was destroyed. The Council watched the recording in complete silence. When it finished, Archon Velder turned to Admiral Chun. His voice shook when he spoke. "Those 47 ships in the Veth system. That is more than half of your remaining military." Chun nodded. "We came." "Anyway, why?" Velder demanded. "You could have hidden. You could have found a new galaxy. You could have left us to face the Devourers alone." Chun was quiet for a moment. "Because 60 years ago, we sent distress calls to every corner of the galaxy. We begged for help. We pleaded for anyone to come. No one answered." She looked at the Concordance leaders with eyes that held decades of pain. "We were alone. We will not let that happen to another species. Not if we can help it." The council returned to their chamber that night. They did not dismiss the human warning anymore. They voted to prepare for war. The galaxy learned fear, and fear changed everything. Word spread from the capital world to every system in the Concordance. The recordings from the human archive were shared with every species and every government. Soon everyone knew what was coming. The peaceful civilizations that had ruled the Orion Arm for 12,000 years faced a choice. They could deny the truth and continue their comfortable lives until the Devourers came to consume them, or they could change. They chose to change. The transformation began slowly at first. Species that had been rivals for millennia suddenly found themselves sitting at the same tables. The Keth had guarded their shield technology for 5,000 years. Now they shared it with everyone. The Morvani opened their weapons factories to engineers from a dozen different worlds. The crystalline singers of Veth unlocked archives that had been sealed since before the Concordance existed. Ancient grudges were set aside. Old wars were forgotten. The galaxy united in a way it never had before, and at the center of it all stood the humans' admiral. Chun and her officers became teachers and advisors. They traveled to every major world and showed the local militaries how to fight human tactics. Were brutal and efficient, and nothing like what the Concordance had ever seen. The Concordance military doctrine was based on intimidation. Their ships were designed to look impressive. Their weapons were meant to threaten, not to destroy. They had not fought a real war in 3,000 years. The humans showed them how wrong they had been. "Your ships are pretty," Chun told Archon Velder during one training session. "Pretty ships die just as fast as ugly ones. You need to stop building monuments and start building weapons." Velder listened and learned. The Concordant shipyards were retooled to produce vessels based on human designs. They were not as advanced as the Unbroken, but they were far better than anything the Concordance had built before. The weapons were heavier. The armor was thicker. The crews were trained to fight, not to negotiate. But the transformation was not easy. Some species refused to believe the danger was real. They accused the humans of manipulation and demanded that the alliance be broken. Others believed but did not think they could change in time. They sank into despair and waited for the end. And some grew suspicious of the humans themselves. Why had the Devourers ignored the Concordance? Why had they only attacked humanity? Perhaps the humans had done something to draw the monsters to the galaxy. Perhaps this was all their fault. Selvith heard these whispers, and they troubled her. She went to Admiral Chun and asked the question that haunted her thoughts. Why did the Devourers attack you, and not us? Chun was silent for a long time. They stood together on the observation deck of the Unbroken and watched the stars' wheels slowly past. "Do you know the history of my species, Chun?" Finally asked. "A little," Selvith replied. "We observed your world 2 centuries ago." "You were primitive then?" Chun nodded. "We were primitive, but we were not peaceful. Humans have been fighting each other since we climbed down from the trees. War is in our blood. We perfected the art of killing long before we discovered how to travel between stars." She turned to face Selvith. "The Devourers are predators. They do not attack randomly. They identify threats and eliminate them before those threats can grow. When they entered the galaxy, they scanned every species they encountered. They saw the Concordance. And they calculated that you were harmless. Your weapons were weak. Your tactics were ceremonial. You had forgotten how to truly fight. Her voice grew quiet. Then they saw us. They saw a species that had never stopped fighting. They saw weapons designed to kill, not to threaten. They saw soldiers who knew how to hate, and they recognized something familiar. Selveth felt cold spreading through her body. They saw predators, she whispered. Chun nodded. They saw predators, and predators did not tolerate competition, so they tried to destroy us before we could become a threat. She smiled, but there was no joy in it. They miscalculated. The months passed and the preparations continued. Fleets were built and soldiers were trained. The galaxy that had been soft and peaceful became hard and ready. But Selveth noticed something else changing as well. The humans who had come to help them were different from what she had expected. They were warriors. Yes, they were killers without equal. But they were also tired. They were broken in ways that did not show on the surface. She watched Admiral Chun training young concordance officers. The human woman was patient and kind, and she smiled when her students made progress. But late at night, Selveth would find her alone on the observation deck, staring at the stars with eyes that saw nothing but ghosts. The war had cost humanity everything. Their colonies were ash. Their people were dead. Their future was a question mark, and yet they had come here to help strangers who had ignored their suffering. Selveth did not understand it. She asked Chun about it one night as they watched a new fleet launch from the shipyards. "You have every reason to hate us," Selveth said. "We could have helped you. We could have answered your calls. We did nothing." Chun was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she admitted. "Some of my people do hate you. They think we should have let you burn. But hatred is a fire that consumes the one who carries it. We have burned enough." She looked at Selveth with those ancient, tired eyes. "The war made us into weapons. Here is our chance to become something else. Something more than just killers." Selveth understood then why the humans had really come. They were not just saving the Concordance. They were trying to save themselves. The second wave arrived 6 months ahead of schedule. It came screaming out of the darkness between galaxies, and it was larger than anyone had predicted. The sensors lit up across 1,000 systems as the Devourer Armada announced its presence. There were so many of them. They filled the void like a living, tidy biomechanical nightmares twisted together in shapes that defied sanity. And they were hungry. The first targets were the outer colonies of the Concordance. 3 worlds fell in the opening. Hours before the defense fleets could respond, billions died screaming as the Devourers descended. Monsters consumed everything. Cities became feeding grounds. Oceans were drained dry. The very atmosphere was stripped away to fuel the endless hunger. But this time, the galaxy was not sleeping. Admiral Chun had positioned her forces perfectly. Human destroyers and Concordance cruisers formed battle lines at every strategic point. The singers of Veth wove gravitational harmonics that disrupted the Devourer formations. The Keth shields held against weapons that would have vaporized them a year before, and the soldiers fought. They fought with weapons designed by humans and built by a dozen species. They fought with tactics learned from 60 years of war. They fought with a fury born of terror and desperation and hope. The first major battle took place in the Morvani system of Devourer. Swarm of 5,000 creatures attacked the industrial stations that orbited the gas giants. They expected easy prey. They found instead a combined fleet of 300 warships. Waiting for them, Admiral Chun commanded from the bridge of the Prometheus. Her flagship was the oldest and most battered vessel in the human fleet. It had survived every major battle of the war. The scars on its hull told stories of 1,000 desperate engagements. All ships. Chun spoke into the fleet-wide channel. Remember what we fight for. Remember who waits for us to come home. And remember that these monsters die just like anything else. Make them die. The battle began with a barrage of fire that turned the darkness into day. Concordance weapons blazed alongside. Human cannons, missiles, and energy beams and kinetic rounds filled the space between the fleets. The Devourers charged forward, and they did not slow down even as their front ranks were torn apart. They crashed into the defense line like a wave against rocks, and the rocks-held ships died on both sides. The Devourers wrapped their tendrils around cruisers and tore them open. They fired biological weapons that ate through armor like acid. They screamed on frequencies that drove unprotected minds to madness. But for every Allied ship that fell, a dozen Devourers were destroyed. The training had worked, the weapons had worked. The Alliance had worked. When the battle ended 6 hours later, the Morvani system was secure. The Devourer swarm had been annihilated. The cost was terrible. 87 Allied ships were gone, and their crews with them. But 5,000 monsters had been stopped. It was the first major victory against the Devourers that anyone other than humanity had ever achieved. The war continued for 11 days. Battle after battle raged across the Concordance. Worlds burned and stations fell, the dead numbered in the billions. But slowly the tide began to turn. The combined fleets learned to coordinate better with each passing hour. The Devourers found no easy prey anywhere they turned. Every system was defended, every world was protected, every inch of space was contested. On the 10th day, the main Devourer force made its final push. It drove straight for the heart of the Concordance, the capital world. If it fell, the Alliance would shatter. Everything they had built would be for nothing. The defense fleet gathered in orbit. 600 ships from 18 species formed up around the human vessels. At their center, the Prometheus waited like an ancient predator admiral. Chun looked at the sensor displays and saw the Devourer armada approaching. There were still so many of them, thousands of nightmares blotting out the stars. "Admiral," her first officer spoke up, "we are receiving communications from across the fleet. They want to hear from you." Chun nodded and opened the channel. Every ship in the defense force heard her voice. "I have spent most of my life fighting these creatures. I have watched them consume worlds and murder billions. I have buried friends and family and everyone I ever loved. For 60 years I have asked myself one question. Why do we keep fighting when the cost is so high?" She paused and looked at the bridge crew around her, humans and concordant species working side by side. "Today I know the answer. We fight because we are not alone anymore. We fight because every species in this fleet chose to stand together. We fight because the darkness is not as strong as the light we create when we stand united. Today we do not fight for survival. We fight for the future, and we will win." The final battle lasted 9 hours. It was the most brutal engagement the galaxy had ever seen. Ships rammed Devourers when their weapons ran. Dry crews fought hand-to-hand in boarding actions that left corridors filled with the dead. The Prometheus took damage that would have destroyed any other vessel 10 times over, but it kept fighting. Chung kept fighting. Everyone kept fighting. And in the end, the Devourers broke. Survivors of the Armada scattered into the Void Hunter-Killer squadrons pursued them, but that was a task for another day. The battle was over. The war was won. Selveth found Admiral Chun 3 days later. Human woman stood on an observation platform above the capital city. Below them, the world was beginning to heal. Fires were being extinguished. Rubble was being cleared. The dead were being mourned. But there was also hope. Children played in the streets again. People laughed and cried and held each other. Life continued. "We lost so many," Selveth said quietly. Chin nodded. "We always do, but fewer than we would have without your help." Selveth looked at the human admiral. The woman was more tired than ever now. Scars marked her face and her mechanical arm was damaged, but something in her eyes had changed. The shadows were still there, but there was also light. "Why did you really come here?" Selveth asked. "You told us before, but I want to understand." Chun was silent for a long moment. 60 years ago, my species was alone. We called for help, and no one came. We faced the darkness by ourselves, and it nearly destroyed us. We survived, but we lost something along the way. We forgot what it felt like to hope. She turned to look at Selveth. Coming here gave us a chance to be more than survivors, more than weapons. It gave us a chance to remember why we fought so hard to live. We fought because life is worth protecting. All life, even the life of strangers who never helped us. Selveth felt tears forming in her eyes. The stars chose fear when you arrived. She said, "That is what everyone says." Chun smiled. It was the first real smile Selveth had ever seen from her. The stars chose fear, but we chose hope, and hope won. Above them, the stars shone down on a galaxy that was wounded but alive, wounded but united, wounded but ready to face whatever came next, together. The human fleet had arrived as strangers. They departed as family, and the galaxy would never forget what they had sacrificed, what they had given, what they had taught everyone about the strength that comes from standing together against the dark.